So hi and welcome everyone to this fourth cultural activity, Conversation with Alexandra Palmer, the legacy of Christian Dior, presented as part of the Dior exhibition at the McCord Museum. I introduce myself, Leila Afriat. I'm a project manager, education, community engagement, and cultural program at the McCord Museum. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge that we are on an unceded indigenous territory and that the Ganyengeyaga Nation has an historical attachment to this territory, which is called Jojage. These lands were and are a gathering place for many indigenous nations and their ancestors. We pay our respect to them and to those of other community who may be with us today. We are very happy to be able to meet you for this virtual event and to see you again in this magnificent Dior exhibition. I have the great pleasure to welcome Alexandra Palmer, Senior Curator at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, and Cynthia Cooper, Head Collection, Research, and Curator Dress, Fashion, and Textile at the McCord Museum. Before handing over to our guest, I would like to inform you that this activity will last 45 minutes in English, and it will be followed by a 15 minutes Q&A that can be addressed both in French and in English via the Zoom platform and on the museum Facebook page. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, Alexandra, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be sending this out to you today from the McCord Museum. Our institution is currently closed. We await news of when we can reopen. We will find out perhaps in January, but it's been wonderful to come in today and to see the Dior exhibition that's still here that we mounted in late September. And we will be working on having an extension so that you can come and visit us and see the exhibition. But for now, we thought we'd whet your appetite yet again with this interview with Dr. Alexandra Palmer. So just to explain, this is a traveling exhibition curated by Dr. Palmer from the Royal Ontario Museum. And we are presenting it here, but it was really a great pleasure in our case because we have a number of Dior garments in our collection. We were able to work on content with Alexandra Palmer and Dior Héritage and add some of our own things to this exhibition. So just to begin, and by way of introduction to you, Alexandra, I'd really like to give our listeners a sense of the depth of your knowledge and your research on Dior. So could you take us way back to the very beginning and tell us how you started this work?
Well, it's a long story. It started with the Royal Ontario Museum collection. That was the basis for my dissertation on haute couture in general. And I was interested in those particular objects. When I was working there on contract, I noticed that all these beautiful clothes were not as pristine as one is normally led to believe. And I was curious as to who wore them, how they wore them, what they did with them, why clothes looked like they'd had fun with, the hemlines that had danced quite a lot at night and different things like that. So I went back to many of the women who were still alive then and interviewed them. I talked to the sales ladies who sold the stuff. I went to Paris to find out how it got from France to North America to Canada. And so I was interested in kind of the world of couture and what happens to things when they leave the design house. And that was really what my dissertation was about. And then it ended up, part of that, the European stuff ended up being in my book, Couture and Commerce. And that was the first kind of exploration of that in lots of ways. And we looked at what happened to them in Canada, and fabulous fashion shows, the importance of Eaton's and the department stores, and with Dior, Holt Renfrew, which signed the exclusive license. So when I started doing this, couture houses didn't have archives. The only ones that did were Christian Dior, which was in very marginalized conditions, not splendid like it is today. The Héritage is stunningly beautiful. So it was in sort of the back of this building in filing cabinets near a closet where there were brooms. And they said, okay, you know, help yourself. And I was looking at these legal documents and masses of things about contracts. And that went beyond the clothes and beyond the designs. The other house that had archives was Balenciaga. That was Madame Marie-André Jouve, who was looking after that collection. But the business records weren't there. So Dior is very exceptional in that it was founded post-war for a post-war economy with an idea of what it could be that exploded beyond anything they had in mind at the time in 1947. But they have this extraordinary archive that really has the records that tell you who made things, what happened to them, licensing, all the kinds of products they did. That really doesn't exist in many other places. It's because the house exists today. It continued. It was set up with a very big business structure from the outset, rather than a couturier who's trying to run a boutique and sort of make ends meet in a way that was much more what generally happens in couture. This was set up as a business enterprise in a modern way, with big funds behind it from Marcel Boussac. So Dior was pretty exceptional. And when I was talking to the women who had their clothes, and I was interested in haute couture, I was interested in lots of designers we don't know about, who aren't brands today, that's really hard to tease out information about, but everyone had a Dior practically. Everyone kept saying, oh no, well, what about Dior? Dior was the best. And I was sort of like, I don't want to know about Dior. There's more books on Dior than anyone else. I want to know about the other people. And then, you know, Dior just kept circling back. And then I wrote the book for the Victoria and Albert Museum on the business part, which was, again, when they asked me to write a book on Dior, I thought, oh, great, what we need, one more book on Christian Dior, the one couturier maybe we know a lot about. So I decided to write on the licenses and the stuff that had not been written about. And then for this exhibition, it really was a chapter that came out of that, was ideas that came out of that book, which was very much about the way the clothes are made and what was it about the new look. Why did it work? Why did people care? And what was it physically in the garments themselves? So that very kind of material culture approach, close looking at how things are, really looking back deep into the house, became very interesting. And that's really the genesis of this exhibition.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm very familiar with that very important book, that one more book that is a very important addition to the literature. And so can you tell us a bit more? And I'm also fascinated the fact that just a single chapter in that book could lead to this exhibition. But could you tell us a bit more about your considerations then when you went looking through the ROM collection for items for this exhibition? What were you looking at and how did you make your choices?
Well, the ROM collection is a textile collection that's worldwide and across time. It's not just fashion. That we have over 55 pieces, so we're global, fashion and textiles. And the couture collection was started in 1957, deliberately at the ROM at a time that changed policy, and they decided you could collect contemporary dress. And they went on a drive. It was founded with the Toronto branch of the New York Fashion Group to deliberately collect examples of high design for designers, Canadian designers, to look at as models in kind of the classic 19th century Victoria and Albert Museum and museological styles of examples of great design as models for future designers. So, and because Dior had a license in Canada, and because he was Dior and extremely successful, there were quite a lot of dresses. And so we're not really a designer archive in that way. The museum does a lot of different things. But Dior is one designer that we have very many designs of, as well as Balenciaga, probably the top designers of the 50s. And that's because this is by donation. and that's what women wore, and that's what women wanted to wear in Canada. So that interests me of why fashion works if it doesn't go onto the street. You know, we have these spectacular things on the runway, but you know, how are you going to bring that into your life?
Alexandra, I think we've just made an unexpected connection here that probably neither one of us planned to talk about, but our collection was officially begun right around the same time, 56 or 57, with much the same aims and
Right.
the same sorts of material that started to be collected at that very moment. So I think that's a very interesting coincidence then that our two collections were growing at the same time, took off.
It was what was happening. And I think at that point, the department store Eaton's was very important. And in Toronto, Dora Matthews, who was the woman in charge of kind of merchandising and buying things, and this is before Holt Renfrew had the license for Dior and they could get Dior. And one of her dresses, Cherie, is actually given by her, very new look design, was very important in that. And I'm sure your woman, was it Doreen Day or in Montreal, her equivalent, these women were very important in the fashion group and in the fashion world, and were very, very interested in, and of course they knew who was shopping and who was buying things, so they could then go ask them to reach into their wardrobes and donate it to Canadian museums. So this is a story that recurs with a lot of collections in America, certainly.
Right, fascinating. And so tell us a bit more about the new look. I mean, what it made Christian Dior famous. What was it that was different about the new look? But more importantly, as you say yourself, a look doesn't take off unless women really want to wear it. What was it about Dior's new look that appealed to women?
So Dior opened in spring, in February 1947. This is right after the war. Europe was decimated and very sad when you read what the buyers and people who were going back to Paris, and there was the issue of would North Americans come back to France, would they need Europe in terms of design and merchandising, because the Paris had been closed and Europe had been inaccessible. And there was a fear that particularly the American market wouldn't need Paris and then wouldn't need to shop there. And they needed their money very badly. So what Dior did was present this whole a complete look. And as I said, he had big pockets behind him, which really helped. So he had a brand new house that was sparkling, whereas other houses were sort of tatty because they'd gone through the war. And his was new and looking, didn't bring any pre-war baggage, didn't bring any 19th century things except what he wanted with him that was a sort of historicized version. And so he wanted to revive great dressmaking that he saw as a Paris skill. He was very, saw this as reviving French design and French artisanal skills, and keeping all the people who work in the ateliers and across all the industries, ancillary industries of couture together. So it was a national project in some ways. It was very much about keeping fashion alive and keeping Paris as the epicenter of fashion. So his small waists, big skirts.
Sorry, if we could just have the first slide, please. We can show some of those small waists and skirts in the exhibition.
So this new look was a very kind of retro look. It was very 19th century. It was with corsets, soft shoulders, a new idea of femininity that was actually the antithesis of the war. But women had been working during the war. They'd worn trousers, they'd done all sorts of things and driven machines and been at the front lines as nurses. So I was actually quite irritated with Monsieur Dior for trying to put women back in corsets and doing this stuff. But women loved it and responded to it. And that's what I was interested in, was why it worked. And I think it felt different. It was a completely new feeling physically, because women had square shoulders and kind of loose clothes and very unstructured clothes, really, because of the war, because there wasn't that much material. So his clothes physically enveloped you. These long skirts. Someone told me the story of kneeling down to pick up her child. and the skirt just cascading around her. So she felt like a princess. She'd never had that experience before, never worn petticoats. There's a quote in my book and in that I just loved, that was a fashion writer talking about the rustling of petticoats. So there's a sound of couture. It was everything that really signified that we were going forward, things were all right. And I think it was a clear signal that the war was over. And he put all these things together that were definitely going around and other designers were doing, but he had the wherewithal economically and the vision to really put it all together in a complete way, with the hat, new hairdos, the pace of the models, the perfume. It was all just astonishing.
And I think that this image here of dresses in a showcase in the gallery captures that romantic feeling, that 19th century inspiration that was so important in his early New Look pieces.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously appealed. Otherwise, women would not have bought it. They would not. And of course, there were the protests, the anti-Dior club, and the husbands who were complaining and stuff. But really, I mean, a lot of that just made good marketing, I think.
Another thing that I think is very significant in this exhibition is all the loan material that you've brought in, particularly from archives in Europe and in France. And if we could have the next slide, we'll see the showcase, the bamboo dress and its accompanying archival materials. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about those loans and how you chose them?
Yeah, well, what's interesting, there's one name on a label that says Christian Dior Paris, but it's the people who work to make that possible that interest me. And it's this infrastructure that really goes back centuries, I mean, practically to guilds in the Middle Ages, and certainly to 18th century France and the establishment of the silk industries in Lyon, this idea of seasonal styles that were determined by textile design and that created new markets and more audiences, as there's a larger sort of bourgeoisie and merchant class available to buy more things, so you make more products. So it's the manufacturers who have to decide in advance what those colors are going to be, what the textiles are going to be, what's going to appeal to people. And when you're providing for the couture, you've got very small numbers there because everyone wants something exclusive. And maybe they'll take a textile and say, yes, okay, well, we like this, but maybe it won't show up in the collection. They won't actually end up using it. So the archives of Staron, who is a big manufacturer, textile manufacturer and ribbon maker in France, are in the Museum of Art and Industry in Saint-Étienne, and an extremely helpful curator there, conservator, who knows the collection really well and could help me find things and put things together. So we know through that who was, that they were trying different colorways for this design. They were, who the printer was, that he had, I think, 7 different screens to make it. And that Christian Dior, in this case, chose the brown version as opposed to the orange version. So it's these details, and these people are working far ahead of anything that Christian Dior is doing. And I'd never actually thought about sequins before. I thought sequins just existed. I spoke to a sequin maker and manufacturer, and there were so many of those historically, with very, really one left standing today. And these incredible embroideries, this the black one being by Rebé, who was a personal friend of Dior. And we also have the House of Eurel that still exists today, their embroideries. And they need these different supplies in order to make these astonishing designs. So kind of drilling down in some of these things, there's something like this, which is ending up in a jacket Pondichéry, and Dior changes the colors and different things happen. And it has this sort of neo-18th century kind of Mughal, Pondichéry being a French colony in India. Out of really simple materials in some ways. These are different colored gilt threads. shells, different shapes of sequins, sometimes many different materials in one object, such as a dress palmire, or only like 3 or 4 or 5, but used in highly creative ways that give texture and color and shade. That's really astonishing. And that's the creativity of the embroiderers. And these are designers as well. And the couture can't get started without wonderful textiles, wonderful design ideas in all these different trades, laces, feather makers. It's astonishing. And when you go back to, say, Diderot, the encyclopedia of the 18th century, it's all in there. And these are the people who were really keeping these incredible skills and creativity alive today.
Mm-hmm. Let's show the next slide. Okay, the next one, please. So this is the second major theme in the exhibition, the late day dresses. And there are a number of McCord dresses in this section.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was very happy to work with you, Cynthia, and McCord's a wonderful collection. I think you're a fabulous curator. And because the Holt Renfrew was a Quebec-based company, and Alvin Walker, who was the president of it and who signed the deal with Monsieur Dior, was here in the 50s, you had really wonderful things as well. And you have a fabulous collection of Dior's. I was very happy to see that you could bring some out. So can you talk about your collection?
Sure. Well, in this late day section, we were able to add 4 dresses from the McCord collection. We see two here, the purple and the rust-colored one. And if we can move ahead to the next slide.
The purple one, I think it was the cover of a magazine too, wasn't it?
Yes, that's quite possible. Maybe Harper's Bazaar, I think, if I remember correctly. And we chose dresses that would complement what you had and fill in the gaps. So this polka dot dress in the foreground has a remarkably similar fabric to the other polka dot dress that you see here, which is in your collection. There were a lot of interesting coincidences like that. In the next slide, we see 4 dresses that belong to one Montrealer, the very well-dressed Margaret Rawlings Hart. And we have so much of our Dior comes from her, so much belonged to her, that we decided to make a special little subsection just to show examples of what she purchased as a client. And in the next slide.
This is nice because you see the range of Dior and the range that a client went to in terms of day and night.
Mm-hmm. And I just love this image of her photographed in fall 1947 in Dior's Cabaret, Dior's Dior's second collection, fall 47. And this dress had been described by Vogue as the lowest neckline in Paris. And she chose to wear that for this family photograph. But I thought we might look at some of our McCord dresses in detail together, Alex, and just comment on them and what makes them so special. This one is called Pentecôte, and it's
so modern.
Yeah, it's from spring summer 1942, and what I thought was so interesting about it is the way it looks like 2 contrasting fabrics. Well, it is. But one is a silk organza that overlays a beige silk twill. So it looks like 2 different colors.
It's very difficult technically to realize that, and it's perfectly done. So it's one of these little suits that's so subtle. And it's I can't imagine making that. I mean, that's a total nightmare. The other thing that's really interesting is Martin Margiela basically did this too. He overlaid chiffon on a woman's jacket that's very masculine kind of thing. So these things are so contemporary. And if you look at the waistline with those like impeccable darts, and that's very Dior, how the darts really shape and then they just tail off perfectly. So you have this smooth hip with no seam, nothing around it to make you look really fabulous. That is very difficult.
And there are little pads in the front of the hips on this jacket. He used that quite a bit, didn't he, that device?
Oh yeah, you've got to, you know, it makes you look like you have a smaller waist, right? Which is what all those 19th century hoops were about too. I mean, he knew what he was doing. He knew how to really frame the female form and make you look à la Dior, really, but really, really fabulous. But I mean, you were there. The dress never overwhelmed you. You looked great, but I think you were always you in it as well. And that was really one of his secrets, I think.
This one is called Wir Revolt. It's from probably fall winter 1955, and it gives such a nice silhouette in this image. But if we look at the actual details of the dress, what I was fascinated to see was Wir Revolt, which means sort of like a somersault. I think refers to the twisting to create in this shawl collar, to sort of create this this loop where the collar sort of turns over on itself and twists around. And the detail that I thought was most exciting on this was the way the belt, if we could just go back, please. The belt is stitched in one piece with the waistband. The belt is the waistband. It looks like a separate belt, but this way you could be sure that with that short jacket, it would always be in exactly the right place.
Yes, and that's also a very Dior thing, that you really look perfect. And in a way, when you buy his clothes, they're engineered so that you don't have to fuss with them once you're in them, and sometimes you need help to get in them. Also in that in the front, you can see that little another little dart at the front, which allows the stomach to be flat. So Cynthia, is the collar is part of it. It's cut in one with the top.
That's right.
Yeah, and that's a very 30s. That's a very, comes out from Madeleine Vianney and all that. So he was really experimenting with those kinds of things. And again, very modern. So this is that, you know, Prada might look at.
Mm-hmm. The next dress is from the collection called Ligne Oblique, and the model is called Discrétion. But what I was fascinated with was, I think if the oblique idea is carried out in that the buttonholes in the bodice are actually on a slant. And then I think the next slide shows this very clever slanted seam in the lapel, cut in one with the bodice again. And I thought it was quite fascinating the way he carried out the idea of the line translated into even these small details.
So these cuts are really, really complicated, and they're all kinds of science experiments. And these are the women and the men in the atelier that are working these out in very, very precisely. And then someone actually has to sew them up, which is also very difficult. So again, all the people who make these things, the names of those people that we know because the Dior records are so extraordinary, were included in the exhibition and in the book, because these are the workers that we don't normally recognize. And I think it's important, as I think Dior wrote about, and Dior thought it was important too, to recognize, you know, that it really takes quite a large village actually to run a couture house and have things up and running and produce these just fantastic things.
Mm-hmm. And in the next slide, we see one of our evening dresses, which is here right next to me in the gallery I'm in, which was called Soirée de Décembre. So what I love is the curved seams in the front. But if we go to the next slide, you can see what's exciting here is the Dior label that tells us about the licensing agreement. And I also couldn't resist putting in a picture of the seam finishing, one of the seams in the skirt, just to show how painstaking it was. But could you tell us a bit more about the Dior Holt Renfrew license and what this label means?
Well, it means that theoretically, Holt Renfrew paid Dior to have the exclusive right to buy and sell Christian Dior across Canada, and Holt Renfrew had stores across the country, from the east to the west coast. The main stores being in Toronto and Montreal, of course, because of population. he could choose from the Dior Paris lines. Dior also opened up Christian Dior, Dior New York and later London. So they also had the rights to sell those things, as well as, and very importantly, if you're a retailer, all the licenses for perfumes, gloves, handbags, jewelry, all those accessories, makeup. Dior went into makeup, which made a lot of money and which people could afford. Maybe you couldn't afford a Dior dress, but you know, maybe someone would buy you some perfume, or maybe you could have gloves or something. And these things were very important, as well as millinery and shoes. Roger Vivier was the shoe designer and the only person to have his name on a Christian Dior label aside from Christian Dior, which was very interesting. And so Holt's was very, very important in Canada, and was the second license. The first one, I think it was in South America. So Dior wanted to control his image, and this is what it was about. And of course, you paid to do that. And it meant that the other stores, when I spoke to Monsieur Rouet, who was in charge of all the licenses, he said, you know, it was a big deal because they had to also, for Dior, not allow the other shops like Eaton's and Morgan's and all those other department stores to be able to buy Christian Dior. So, you know, it was a deal not only that was about money, but also exclusivity and controlling how the brand looked and how it was presented.
Mm-hmm.
And in the exhibition, sorry, we have some videotapes from well, film actually, from the old television of fashion shows and things happening in Holt Renfrew in the stores, which was big social occasions.
Mm-hmm. Some of them are, I think, show Holt Renfrew in Montreal, which is really nice to be able to have that local touch in our presentation of the exhibition here. And the dress we were just discussing, Soirée de Décembre, I thought was exceptional because it's pristine. It appears unaltered. And so many of the Dior dresses in our collection have been altered in significant ways. And I think that's something that you found too in your collection. And could you speak to that a little bit? And then maybe we could.
That's something that interested me from the outset before my dissertation, and why that I chose that subject. Because you think that these are very wealthy women who wear haute couture, and they kind of like wear a dress and drop it behind them and move on to another one and kind of discard them. But it wasn't like that at all. They invested in the dresses, they wore them a lot, and they altered them. And part of that was because some of them, they were brought in, and so they were not actually made to measure in the couture salon, so they had to fit them. And so alterations were made. All the department stores had very good alteration rooms, and very good, often European women who worked in there to make sure things fit, as well as really the women just loved the clothes. And as they changed, or styles changed, hemlines very much going up and down, which was one of Monsieur Dior's things, you know, that's very easy to alter. But it wasn't that it wasn't that they couldn't afford something else. It's because they loved that dress and they loved the way it made them feel and how they felt they looked in it. Because there have been, do you have some extensive alterations?
Yes, and I thought if we can jump ahead to the next dress, I thought it'd be interesting to look at some of these and just the extent to which they were altered. This is Cabaret, that dress I mentioned earlier, that belonged to Mrs. Hart, shown here on the Dior model with the lowest neckline in all of Paris. And if we move ahead to the next slide, you'll see in the image on the left, the front of the dress, the buttons have been moved way over so that the opening is actually kind of asymmetrical to make the neckline perhaps a little less open. And I think that this is, well, all Mrs. Hart's clothing were bonded models, and maybe that helps to explain why hers would be so altered. So maybe you could tell us a bit about what bonded models were.
Well, bonded models were interesting. The system of importing haute couture into North America was very taxed. And so it was really a system that emerged in the States to get around taxes. So when you bring in luxury goods, they're taxed according to belts, buttons, zippers, different kinds of things. So some things would even be packed separately, so the belt was somewhere else. And all those fittings and the metal, the sequins, all those things would raise the tax. So to import haute couture, which the department stores and manufacturers in North America wanted to show that they were prestigious, that they were up to date, to sell them to make money, to attract a elite clientele, and if you're a manufacturer, to copy something and make money out of it in a North American market. So these things, many of them were brought in not really for resale so much, but for design dissemination ideas. So if they were brought in bond, it meant that they came into customs and they were allowed to be in North America, in the US, for 3 to 6 months with avoiding duty, which was massive. But the caveat was that they had to export it out of the country within that time or pay the duty. So by the time you brought the clothes in, knocked them off, had them on the fashion shows, done whatever you wanted to do, really that season was over and they were done with. So the shops sold them to Canada, across the line, 49th parallel, very easy way to get them out. And Canadian buyers and retailers were very eager to have these things, many which were sort of slightly worn, and often very avant-garde designs that they might not be able to afford to bring in because of the richness of the design. And then they brought them into Canada, and the stores sold them, got a bit of money back, avoided the duty. The Canadians got, and South Americans got relatively, in fact, much reduced couture, and then would phone up their favorite buyers and their most influential ladies and say, bonded models are in, and everyone would just drop everything and go. And they would already be sort of pre-selected for the ladies, so that the buyers, everyone would kind of, you know, parceling them out was important in terms of keeping your clientele happy.
Right. So. And Mrs. Hart was obviously on that list, and her next dress, Topaz. One of the things I love about this is it's the silk is goffered. The pleating seems to be done with a sort of iron that the fabric would be sandwiched between on two sides. You can sort of see horizontal marks at each where it went through the machine at each pass. And so I think that this treatment probably would not survive dry cleaning. And yet how would you sit in a full skirt like this? And I only understood this I only came to think about this because of this mysterious slit in the back left. And the dress has actually a narrow skirt underneath. So I think when you sat down, you could just lift up your skirt and separate it and sit on your narrow skirt with no pleats and not muss up any of your pleats. But what was interesting here is you'll see that it's got this beaded belt. And if we look at the next slide, from the House of Dior, the sketch and the press photograph show us that this belt was not originally beaded. So that's something that probably the store added for Mrs. Hart because she was having it taken out at the waistline. I think that's probably what was going on there. And the next slide, this is the couture house, their photographs and sketch for a dress called Dior. Dior being the name of a fruit and vegetable market, I think, in Paris. And you had pointed out to me how significant this was because of the print fabric. But when I really started to examine it, you look at the full pleated skirt that you see here, and then in the next slide, we see that it's been taken apart and made into a slim, narrow skirt for Mrs. Hart. So I thought that was quite interesting because what we're looking at is alterations that in such a case, in a case like this, really are not the couturier's original intent. It's really making a different dress altogether.
It could have been done much later, you know, when the slimmer line came in, but it really is a fantastic textile. And what tends to survive much more the plain the plain fabrics and, you know, black and navy and things that are more kind of classic, because these prints are much more dated and recognizable if you wore it repeatedly. But they're really wonderful, and they're most fantastic textile printers in France. So it really is a lovely design.
Mm-hmm. I think that before we move on to questions, we could just look at a couple of slides showing the evening dress section. I'm seated in front of the pink dresses that you see. Mm-hmm. And perhaps this is a good point for us to tell you what is really the takeaway for this exhibition. What do you want visitors to understand and experience when they see this show?
Well, these are the years it's bracketed, 1947 to 1957, which is the 10-year period of Monsieur Dior, because he died unexpectedly. So these are in some ways the kind of golden years of the house, but also of kind of 50s couture and the revival of Paris couture as a leader in fashion design. And what it was that Dior was doing in terms of a new way forward of marketing, of presenting these ideas that were always novel, but always saleable and had enough of an older line. So your dress, the one not Cine Noir, the one behind it that you showed, the black one with the curved head. Like, that is very, very, very modern. That's really looking forward to something that's very pared down and simple. And so he would do that, and then he'd offer you something that was maybe a bit more familiar. So he was always really going forward and pushing design, but being very careful to keep his client with him. And the other thing really in the show is a very simple idea of, you know, the infrastructure and the numbers of skills and artisans that are required to make clothes. Whether it's haute couture or anything today, we have, you know, you need a lot of people who contribute to that, from the person who dyes the color of the silk, who spins the silk, to the very end game, which is the dress that you buy in the shop. But you know, fashion is complicated, and designing is complicated, and understanding what to do with materials, how to choose them. It's just kind of breathtaking, the decisions that are involved, and with so many people.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I think we can, I think we had maybe one more slide that shows just a view of the gallery, just to entice people to come when we do reopen. And I think we could move on. We have some questions for you. One viewer asks, what would you say are the differences in the Dior style and the Chanel style in the same period?
Well, Chanel was not very nice about other designers, and Monsieur Dior was a bit more polite. Chanel did not approve of Monsieur Dior's designs with corsets and fittings, and basically you had to have someone else get you in and out of certainly the evening clothes and late afternoon clothes. To her, that was abhorrent. She was a woman. She sort of, you know, pulled herself up by her bootstraps, of completely different background. So she, you know, her clothes had pockets, her clothes were much easier, and she didn't change styles in this. You know, Dior would introduce a new line and a new name and a new idea every season. And she did not. The Chanel suit, which really she developed in the 20s and even in the teens in a way, really remained the same. What was different was the textiles and little nuances of it. She took her a long time to use trousers. You know, there was a consistency, these classics that she did with very small differences. And Dior was about this, you know, much more splashy and more interesting in some ways for press photographers and for media. He really catered and knew how to grab the media.
And speaking of being nice and knowing how to grab the media, I was always interested to read the 2 times he visited Montreal. He was very careful to compliment Montreal women on how well they dressed and how elegant they were, just like Parisian women. Really flattered everybody. And
He was a real gentleman, I think, you know, he really was.
Yeah. Another question we have here is that could you come back to the business model, how he worked with Holt Renfrew, and says what someone says, does the collection belong to Holt Renfrew that lends pieces to museums? No, in both cases, they are our collection of items with Holt Renfrew labels. We do look for those, right? Because we're both interested in acquiring those licensed models or the bonded models. But could you tell us a little bit more maybe about the arrangement with Holt Renfrew and how that worked, the workroom that was here in Montreal in Holt Renfrew?
Yeah, so these are arrangements that were international for Dior. He had them in many, many countries around the world, and they were different for different locations and the needs of different areas, clients, whatever. So in Canada, it was Holt Renfrew, the shop. In Montreal only, they had their own workrooms where you could come in and order something made to measure, and Monsieur Dior would send, they also had this in Cuba, I think, and he would send people from the Dior atelier to train people in those places on the Dior techniques and how to do things. So controlling the brand was incredibly important. There was a story when he made stockings, he made Dior stockings. And they had spies everywhere too that would go and look and check that you were not, you know, doing things badly, because the licenses were renewed annually. You didn't just get it; you had to kind of be up to snuff. Otherwise, they'd take it away. And there's letters in the archives about these people just distraught that they're not going to have their license anymore, and what can they do? And that handbag that was copied didn't have anything to do with them. And I mean, there's all these nefarious things that happen that's really interesting. So it you know, but it was the merchandising in the store so that Holt could have the furs also, which was very important for Canada, given our climate. And really you can, you know, if you wanted Christian Dior designs, which you did, because he was one of the most important couturiers and kind of a safe couturier too, because you looked nice in his clothes, you'd have to go to Holt. So Holt's worked hard to get that. And I also think being from Montreal, being French Canadian and working in the French language must have helped too.
Mm-hmm. That sort of addresses the collection. Do we know if Dior was sold more in Quebec than any other province because of the proximity of French culture? Maybe. Certainly we know it was made here, which wasn't being made in other provinces.
Mm-hmm.
Know if more was sold here. Do we have any idea about that?
I don't know that. I think maybe there was a slightly different taste in Montreal. I mean, this is the more Frenchified than the Anglo-Canadian. And certainly some of the dresses we have that were from Montrealers are extremely sexy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they love that, like the ones from Paula Spiegel, who, you know, love getting compliments from men as she, you know, was walking up the stairs to the theater or something.
Right. There are a couple of questions about copying. How did he prevent his clothes from being copied? And how did he keep the savoir-faire in his house and prevent copying at the same time?
Okay, this is an old story, and you know, Leslie Miller's written a lot about piracy in the 18th century, and there's lots of wonderful scholarship now on fashion espionage, which is really fun. And actually, my chapter in the book on Dior's licensing, the one about piracy was my favorite to write because it was really, really fun, the nefarious things that people would get up to. And so Dior and Francis for a long time had Paris coutures had this, a lot of those pictures, Paris couture in France, couture is considered a design that you can copyright, so it's copyrightable. It is not copyrightable in the US, which is still a problem. So there's two completely different views of this. And because and then coutures making things to order, they have to be made in-house, they have to be new designs every year, they have to be made to measure. with 3 fittings in order to get that haute couture name, which you have to apply for every year. You have to go through these tests to prove that you are of the standard to receive that haute couture appellation. In a way, it's sort of like being, you know, only champagne can be made in Champagne. And so it's a big investment, and the economy of scale is kind of small, but what goes into it is very big in terms of labor and overhead expenses and buying these very expensive textiles, and it goes all the way down the line for everyone who's supplying to the haute couture.
Mm-hmm.
So on one hand, since the 20s and really since the inception of couture, they're keeping these elite custom-made dresses for a private clientele, which is what is haute couture, and makes it that. At the same time, how can they make money doing this? So then they're selling their product to manufacturers or retailers, particularly in North America. And once it leaves their house, they have no physical control over that design. I mean, that's the reality. So they charge more for buyers to come in, and manufacturers there do all these things. They have the bonded arrangement. It just really goes on and on. And Dior is very litigious, and in a way he was litigious for a lot to represent the Paris couture, I think, because he had the money to be able to do that, and he had the business model. He had all the people. He had many people in the business side of the of the house, which most couturiers didn't have. They were design houses, and the business sort of was not so well supported. So he was extremely litigious, and there were all these court cases and everything. And so by controlling the licenses, that was a way to make sure that his products were in the right places and being controlled. But of course, there, you know, design dissemination, and there were model renters. There were all sorts of complicated ways of getting around it. And now with Instagram and I mean, you have to kind of give up on that. I think now it's difficult.
Yeah. A great question to segue into, because we're talking about the money that he had. Who backed him financially, and do we know why? I know you know why, and I know. So tell us about
well, the man was Marcel Boussac, who was one of the richest men in France. He'd made money during World War I on cotton, toile d'Avignon, for those little planes. And he'd made money during World War II. So he was an industrialist. And he had cottons and printed cottons. And he's also very big in the racehorse scene. He had lots of racehorses, and he liked winning. And he met Monsieur Dior, who had been working for Lucien Lelon, who had been the head of the Chambre Syndicale and representing the Paris couture during the war, in a very difficult time with German occupation, and when the Germans wanted to move the couture to Berlin. And Dior had been there listening to all this thing with Pierre Balmain. And so he was invited by Marcel Boussac to meet him, and he knew he was very rich and influential, and invited to take over an existing Paris couture house that you've never heard of, and that was very kind of on its last legs and dwindling. And Dior apparently he was a very shy man, but he went into a sort of passionate speech about how Paris couture had to be resuscitated, and we had to keep all these wonderful workers, and we had to resuscitate Paris as the center, the epicenter for Paris fashion. And he didn't want to do that house. He wanted a new way forward, and he wanted a very small house with the best dresses, the best techniques, and to attract the most influential and most elite women of the world. And Marcel Boussac somehow said, okay, here you go. And then set himself up with Monsieur Rouet and all these other people who from the outset managed it as a business. So Dior was involved in that, but there were very deep pockets behind him. And from his vision that he had for the gray color, that Dior gray that's very beautiful, the sort of neo-18th century boiserie, the fresh paint, the graphic design, working with René Gruer, wonderful illustrator. I mean, Dior knew he'd been an art gallerist, and he was very familiar with contemporary art and historical art. So he was a very cultural and sophisticated man, and surrounded himself with very creative people. So it took off.
I think we can take one more question, and I'm actually going to sneak two in together. Okay. Is Dior still available in vintage stores today?
Yes.
And is there one creation that's remained elusive that you have yet to find, to track down, to see?
That's an interesting question. No, I've never really thought about it like that. I mean, I'm always looking for, hoping people will donate things, and definitely prints and things that are less represented are interesting to me, or new designs. But you know, Dior went on. So what's interesting is that all those ideas that Dior had, and you see it in the jewelry, you see it in the perfumes, those are all the traces, the tropes of the house today. And every single new designer goes back and uses the archives and draws from those very rich designs to create not copies at all. They all do their own wonderful new interpretations of it. But all those things that Dior put in place in 10 years are the sort of racine, the roots, the base of the house, and they go back to them again and again and again, and mine them for new ideas that go forward. So, I mean, he really got something right.
Well, Dr. Alexandra Palmer, it's been fascinating to speak with you today about Dior.
Yeah.
Yet again, but we never seem to exhaust the topic, and I learn things every time. So thank you so much for being with us.
Welcome. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for everyone for their nice questions.
So we'll turn you back over to Leila Afriat. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Mrs. Palmer and Cynthia, for this wonderful presentation. We're hoping that people will come and have the chance to visit the exhibition in person. And we're working to extend the Christian Dior exhibition, and we're looking forward to confirm the date with you soon. Meanwhile, we are now, it's now possible to take a virtual tour of the exhibition. Registration and information are available on the museum website. And I will also thank the public for helping us to continue to offer free cultural virtual activities by making a donation of the amount of their choice. It is possible to do it online on the website of the museum. So to everyone, thank you so much for taking this lunchtime with us for this fourth cultural activity on the Dior exhibition, and we hope we could host you physically in the museum soon. Thank you so much, everyone.